Thank you, Dr. Chung. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kaustubh Bhatt, and I'm talking to you from Maryland, where I'm a graduate student in physics. I'd like to welcome you all to this workshop on growing equity, inclusion, and diversity within the Physics of Living Systems Student Research Network. As we are all aware, diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM in general, and physics in particular, have come under immense scrutiny over the summer. And now we do have some data to inform our actions, especially at the undergraduate level, thanks to the American Institute of Physics and the American Physical Society. At the same time, as Dr. Blagoev touched upon in the morning, if we do not succeed at fostering an inclusive, supportive, and welcoming atmosphere at the high school level, especially in the public school system here in the US, we will not succeed in enriching the physics community. And this is, of course, a multifaceted problem involving not only teachers, but also requires support from family and the higher education system. But today, through this forum, we will discuss ways that we, as the PoLS community, can build alliances with high school teachers. We have a great set of speakers who will talk about topics ranging from new initiatives within the physics community, reaching out to high school physics departments, to making physics more equitable through teacher training, and finally ending with a physics teacher's own experiences teaching at a Title I school. As Dr. Chung mentioned this morning, all of the talks are pre-recorded, so we will play them, but the speakers are available for a live Q&A session after that. To maintain some structure, after we play the talks, I request all of you to type your questions into the chat, and I will read them out in order. Otherwise, I kindly request everyone except the speaker to please mute their microphone to avoid any feedback. With that, we are ready to hear from our first speaker, Dr. Eric Mazur. Dr. Mazur obtained his physics PhD from Leiden University and then came to Harvard in 1982 as a postdoc, where by his own admission, he intended to stay for only 1 year. But then 38 years later, he's still here, now as the Balkanski Professor of Physics and Applied Physics, where his lab works on the cutting edge of nanophotonics. Additionally, he's also a member of the Faculty of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And Dr. Mazur has done pioneering work in science education, focusing on interactive and peer-to-peer approaches to instruction for almost 30 years, for which he has won several accolades. Let's now hear from Dr. Mazur.
Thank the organizers of the GrowPoLS conference for giving me the opportunity to tell you a little bit about an effort I've recently started at Harvard University. I'm a longtime member of the PoLS network. In fact, I was the PI for many years of the Harvard PoLS effort. Now, before I tell you something about my new initiative, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my own background. I came to Harvard in 1982, so almost 40 years ago, as a postdoc, with the idea in my mind to go back to Europe, where I was from, and take on a job in industry. It was never my intention to become an educator. Long story short, after a year and a half as a postdoc, I ended up being promoted to a junior faculty position at Harvard University, which meant that I had to teach. And looking back at that first day of teaching in the early 80s, it strikes me now that I really never asked myself the question, how am I going to teach? What do people who come, non-majors in particular, who come into a physics course at Harvard know about physics? I simply did what my professors had done to me. I lectured. I think we all tend to do that. This is actually a picture of me lecturing many years ago. As you can see, this picture was taken BC, before computers. I'm using an overhead projector. Now, the reason that I started lecturing, as you see illustrated here in this picture, is because I naively assumed that I had learned physics sitting in a classroom like this, listening to my professors lecturing. I think we all tend to do that. We tend to project our own experiences on the world around us. And I'm sure that my professors, when they started teaching in their career, they made exactly the same assumption. They mimicked what their professors had done to them. And so back, generation after generation after generation, all the way to this person. This actually is Henry VIII, King of Germany, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, giving a guest lecture at the University of Bologna somewhere in the 11th century. It's an illustration from an illuminated manuscript of the 14th century representing that scene. And the resemblance with the picture I showed you a moment ago of my own class is just striking. True, we don't wear those clothes anymore, although we do wear them at commencement to remind ourselves that we're steeped in medieval traditions. But the arrangement and even some of the details, as you can see in the front row, the people are paying close attention. The second row here, they're a little bit less engaged, and in the back corner there, they're talking to each other. And then there's this guy, I don't know if he's fast asleep or cringing in agony. Overall, this scene could be any time in the past 1,000 years, except probably, as I said a moment ago, for the closing. Now, it took me a long time to realize that I was not on the right path, that essentially this lecturing created an illusion of being a good teacher, a big illusion. See, I was asked to teach a course that none of my colleagues wanted to teach, physics for pre-medical students. These were not students who wanted to learn physics. They were interested in biology, they were interested in the life sciences. But in order to get into medical school, they had to take physics. And most of them already hated physics before setting foot in my classroom. Now, I didn't know that. And I didn't know that pre-meds were not very kind to physicists when I was given that task. And therefore, most of my colleagues would get rather poor end of semester evaluations and not like teaching this course. Anyway, so I started teaching, I started lecturing, and something really interesting happened. By the traditional standards, I was actually doing a good job. The reason the students liked my lectures, they gave me high end of semester evaluations, 4.5, 4.8 on a 5-point scale. So clearly they liked what I was doing in the classroom. On top of that, they could solve pretty complicated problems. Coming from Europe, the distinction between algebra-based and calculus-based physics didn't make any sense to me. So even though I was supposed to teach an algebra-based course, I taught a calculus-based course. And the students could actually solve some pretty complicated problems on the exam, problems that I wasn't sure I would do well on under the pressure of an exam. So, 1, they liked me as an instructor. 2, they did well on complicated exam. Obviously, I was doing the right thing. In fact, very quickly, I started to believe that I was the world's best physics teacher. After all, my colleagues were not able to teach this course with the same scores as I was. Now, that turned out to be a complete illusion. A pleasant illusion, of course, but nonetheless, a complete illusion. Nothing could be further from the truth. I actually was a very lousy teacher. That only became clear to me when I gave a precursor of the force concept inventory, a simple test that tests students' understanding of the concept of force with words rather than with equations. And something happened that really made me fall out of my ivory tower. I remember there was one question asking students to compare the force that a heavy truck exerts on a light car, how that force compares to the force exerted by the light car on the heavy truck in a head-on collision. Now, all my students could recite Newton's second law, F12 equals F21, and all my students could use that equation in a problem. But clearly, if you replaced 1 by heavy truck and 2 by light car, they forgot all about it, and most of the students were convinced that the heavy truck exerted a larger force on the light car than the other way around. I figured it out once I saw the results of the test, but actually something happened way earlier than that. As soon as the students started taking that test, one student raised her hand and she asked me, Professor Mazur, how should I answer these questions? According to what you taught us, or according to the way I usually think about these things? You might be laughing about this. I certainly wasn't laughing. In fact, I didn't even understand what the question was about. After all, shouldn't the two things be the same? Anyway, that caused quite a bit of introspection and reflection, and this illusion of being a good teacher was shattered within minutes. And upon some further thinking, it became clear to me that my lecturing was actually nothing more than information transfer. I was more or less reading the textbook to the students, and the students were diligently taking notes. In fact, I once heard somebody describe the lecture method as a process whereby the lecture notes of the instructor get transferred to the notebooks of the students without passing through the brains of either. And to some degree, that was true in my class. They were memorizing by rote. They were learning to solve problems by rote. But if I asked anything that was out of the context that they had seen, my students would alarm and say, we've never done a problem like this. But think about it. If they had done a problem like that before, it would by definition no longer be a problem. That made me completely and radically change my approach. You see, education is more than just information transfer. In the traditional approach to education, all of the emphasis is on that step there, the information transfer. But the much more important part is actually the sense-making part. Students need to not just open their skull, put the information in, and then keep it in there long enough to pass the exam. No, they need to extract from that information the mental models, the knowledge that permit them to apply what they've learned. Where did that sense-making take place for you and for me? Think about it. Did that happen while you were listening to your instructor's lecture? Maybe sometimes it did, but probably more often than not, it happened outside of the classroom. So in the traditional approach to teaching, the first step, the information transfer, takes place in class, and then the second step, the sense-making, takes place through study or homework out of class. Now, if you ask yourself the question, which of these two methods is the hardest, of these two parts is the hardest, I think we would all agree it's the second part. So it's kind of ironic that most of us in the classroom put the emphasis on the information transfer rather than the sense making. We should focus on that second step. So that made me actually flip back in 1991, so now almost 30 years ago, my approach to teaching. The term flipping the class didn't occur. Didn't exist at that time. In fact, we didn't start using the term until 10 years later. But essentially, rather than reading my notes and the books to the students, I told them, read it before coming to class. In essence, the information transfer was moved out of the classroom. And then in class, I worked on the sense-making part, the aha moments, by teaching through questioning, a method which I termed peer instruction, and which now is used in many schools and colleges all around the world. Long story short, peer instruction became a success. It became used in many different disciplines. First of all, many people have shown higher learning gains. If you do on Google Scholar a search for peer instruction, you will find something like 10,000 peer-reviewed articles in many different disciplines showing gains in learning. In my own class, I measured the normalized gain that I would get on the FCI and other tests during lecturing, about 25%. So that's 25% of the maximum possible gain. And then after switching to peer instruction, I first doubled and eventually tripled that gain. So this is not a 20 or 30% increase. No, it's a 200% increase. And then studies at Carnegie Mellon have shown better retention, because once you have that aha moment, it sticks. The information, the knowledge, I should say, sticks. Now, you may wonder, well, that works for Harvard students. What about community colleges or high school or whatever? Well, I realized very early on that I needed to show that this was not an Ivy League effect. So I teamed up with a postdoc who was actually teaching at a community college, and we compared the Harvard data with the data that he obtained in his class at a community college. So at Harvard University, you see here the normalized gain in the traditional lecture-based classroom and the first year implementation of peer instruction, which doubled the normalized gain. And the equation for the normalized gain is shown on top there. It's defined as the final score minus the initial score divided by 1 minus the initial score. So it's the fraction of the maximum possible gain, averaged, of course, over the whole student. This permits you to compare different population of students. At the community college, they got a similar gain, a normalized gain. The absolute values of the pre-test and the post-test were pre-test being at the beginning of the semester and post-test at the end of the semester were different, but the gain increased substantially. And just as I found at Harvard, they found a gain in exam performance. So the better understanding of the concepts did not go at the expense of better problem solving, even though far less problem solving was done in the classroom. But here's the interesting thing I want to point out. At the community college, they found that it also helped retain students. Dropout rates at community colleges are big. About 20% of the students drops out of their introductory physics course in community college. After implementing peer instruction, however, as you can see here, the percentage of dropouts went from over 20% to 5%. I never looked at my own data because the dropout rate is not very big, but it turned out that there were actually quite a few students who enrolled in the course at the beginning of the term and then never took the final exam. And then when I compared for traditional and peer instruction, I found actually a similar drop even at Harvard. So higher learning gains, better retention of knowledge, better retention of students. Then later I started studying something called self-efficacy. It's one's belief in being able to succeed in a given domain. I think I can do physics if I try hard enough. Now, we physicists tend to have a high self-efficacy in physics, otherwise we would never have continued. Self-efficacy determines how you deal with setbacks and failure. If you have a high self-efficacy, you tell yourself, well, you know, and you don't do that well, you tell yourself, well, I haven't worked hard enough or I have a bad day. If you have low self-efficacy, you just shrug your shoulders and you say, physics is too hard for me. Well, it turns out that students, non-majors, who take introductory physics courses tend to have very low self-efficacy, even at a place like Harvard. And in a traditionally lecture-based course, the self-efficacy actually goes down over the course of the semester. So they come out with less self-efficacy at the end than they had at the beginning. Using peer instruction, that actually stabilized. But that still left the problem of low self-efficacy. And that started to get me interested in secondary education. What is it that is happening in high schools? And the situation in high schools is nothing less than critical. Only 1/3 of US high school students takes physics. Only 1/3. We live in a world dominated by technology, yet only 1/3 of high school graduates have even been exposed to physics. In some districts, like New York, believe it or not, over 50% of schools don't even offer physics. And only 1/3 of the schools where physics is offered, only 1/3 of the teachers at those schools have actually physics degrees. No wonder we generate a society that, you know, is horrified by physics. I don't know about you, but when I go to a party and I say I'm a physicist, the first thing I get to hear is, oh, physics. I had such a hard time with physics in high school or in college. We have a moral obligation to do something about it, to bridge this gap, to give back to society, and not only to train the next generation of scientists, but to actually train the next generation, period, to educate the people in scientific literacy. So this past summer, with funding from the NSF, I ran a Harvard physics online workshop on education. The name of the workshop was Building a Network to Support and Improve High School Physics Education. The original plan was to have it in person with a small number of teachers, but then we went virtual and realized, hey, we can bring in many more people. So it was attended by 200 high school teachers, and the idea was to start exploring the ideas to form a network of high school teachers by high school teachers for high school teachers, supporting each other and improving the state of high school education teaching. At the end of that workshop, we decided that it would be a good idea to oh, by the way, at the workshop, we had Carl Wyman speak. We had Alan November, who is a luminary in K-12 education, speak. And we had one of my former group members, Catherine Crouch, who is a professor at Swarthmore College, give a presentation of how to fold the physics curriculum into a life science shell. And that gave us the idea to form a network based on the physics of living system to increase the acceptance, if you want, of physics in high school, and to reinvigorate, in a sense, the teaching of physics at high schools. Now, we've met a few times. In fact, yesterday we had a lecture of the PoLS network, and I would like to find ways of bridging the gap between the Physics of Living Systems network and the Physics of Living Systems teacher network. More about that in just a second. I want to jump here for a moment, because just before we ran that workshop, I was actually teaching a team and project-based course. I no longer lecture, as you might imagine. In fact, I no longer even teach in a regular classroom. It's a flat classroom. And in order to increase the intrinsic motivation of these life science majors for physics, it is completely team-based and project-based. Now, when the pandemic hit in March, it all of a sudden became impossible to teach this course. Even if we had been on campus, social distancing would not have been possible, and therefore this type of pedagogy would not have been a viable, or at least a safe, if you want, approach to the pandemic. So it became clear that I could no longer teach the course in the usual way. Students were building things. How could they build something if they were remote? So this year, when I started teaching this course, I thought maybe there's a way that I can combine the different ideas that I just told you about. And for the first project, which was actually 2 weeks ago, which we called At Home with Physics, we basically used as a wrapper for the project the problem in education that was being caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I tasked my students to help teachers who were teaching remote classes and who had their classes remote, to help them develop lesson plans and demonstrations, as well as ideas on how, using a very simple kit, to build equipment and take measurements at home. Now, the fair, which, as I said, was just 2 weeks ago, was attended by over 200 students and teachers. I had the benefit of this budding PoLS network that permitted me to reach out to teachers who were connected. We had 23 high schools participate, spread from US to Mexico, Turkey, Italy, Ecuador. And it was a wonderful way to see how you can bridge higher education and secondary education. And also, what really excited me perhaps the most about it is to see the excitement of my students being able to give back to society given how fortunate they were that they could still attend classes that were taught in a pedagogically sound way. In fact, some students brought their own high school teacher to the fair. So my goal in the coming year, and I hope to find ways of involving you, is to build a bridge between high school and university physics. More specifically, to find ways of having the PoLS network and the PoLS team network work together to form a community that lays the foundation for a society that is scientifically literate and is fine with evidence-based science. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, I am Isa Gallegos, and I'm going to pick up where Eric left off, and I want to talk to you about some specifics, some early accomplishments that we have done through our PoLS T network initiative. So first, really quickly, and I will return back to this at the end of my presentation and give you a little bit more detail, but what I want to share with you is some of the early findings or the early accomplishments. And these are, number one, we asked our initiative participants, the network participants, what they cared about, what mattered to them, or what areas would they like to focus on to improve high school physics education. And what they told us, and this will likely not be a surprise to very many people here, is that number one, they really care about diversity, equity, and inclusion in rigorous physics education. Number two, they care about collaboration, and collaboration in the sense of being able to collaborate with their peers, other high school educators, physics high school educators, but also in working with physics education researchers at the university level, and then continued support in the form of either materials or curriculum or things they can implement that can support their efforts for changing their pedagogy in their classroom. In addition, the second point here, we coordinated and organized a PoLS T core. So this is a subgroup of participants in the PoLS T network who bring a diverse array of expertise into the room and who can serve as an advisory board or a steering committee. And I'll talk in a second about why that is important. And then finally, we've started coordinating monthly talks. So you might be wondering, as physics education researchers, why did we take this approach? Why did we decide to start to build a community of professional practitioners as opposed to perhaps taking our findings from the classroom? Eric earlier talked about self-efficacy and how it's linked to academic achievement. Why we don't just take the findings that we found in the undergraduate classroom and transfer them into the high school physics classroom. And so this talk is about gaps, and we learned about achievement gaps earlier and self-efficacy gender gaps. Now I want to talk about a gap that's a little bit different, and this is a knowledge gap that we had, or an expertise gap that we have as physics education researchers or educators at the university level. And this is summarized by what Professor Linda Darling-Hammond from Stanford calls the problem of complexity. And what I mean by this is that the environment and the context in the high school setting is so different from what we experience at the university setting that even if we have findings that are well supported by evidence, if we don't understand the context and the pressures, incentives, challenges that high school educators face, we can recommend best practices, but if they cannot be implemented because we don't understand how to account for the context, then they won't be successful. And so I'll say a little bit more about this in terms of closing the gap between our knowledge as physics educators and high school teachers. But what became very obvious to us in having conversations with high school educators was that they deal with a wide, diverse body of students at once. They juggle multiple academic and social goals. And on a day-to-day basis, sometimes moment to moment, they have to make calls and decisions and trade-offs based on their environment. This might all sound familiar to us. We all, as educators, deal with this to a certain extent, but I would argue that the way that this happens in the high school classroom is different from what we experience in our own environments. In addition, high school educators have to answer to mandated school reforms and improvement initiatives, oftentimes without little attention to skills or the types of supports that they need to effectively implement this. And so ultimately, this turns into a time limitation, a limitation in resources, and what educators need is to be able to implement things quickly in a way that works for them in their classroom. And so I'll spend the last couple of minutes talking to you, not in depth, but in general terms about the approach we decided to take, which is guided by participatory action research. So as a note, I will clarify that participatory action research, or PAR, is not a prescriptive way of conducting research. All the modes of research are available to us, but it does align us to a set of goals for research where action is the primary focus. So in our case, we want to improve access to quality physics high school education. We want research participants to help shape the research agenda. So this is more than simply being participants. This is being collaborators and colleagues with the people in our network. And so it follows that we have to privilege insider knowledge. And I want to point back here and pause and talk about something that Eric brought up earlier that has to do with this idea of reciprocity, a give and take where all parties are benefited. So Eric talked earlier about inviting high school physics teachers and students into the classroom, into the undergraduate classroom. And so this was important in building our network because rather than coming in and just presenting our researcher identity from the university, and telling people how to do their work, what we wanted to do was to express this collaborative colleague attitude where they could come into our classroom in AP50 and see us be educators as well, so that we could have a common professional experience. Finally, I told you I was going to give you a little bit more detail, and I can talk about this in depth, but in the interest of time, I'll just say that some of our goals for the early stages were modeled after the research in the formation of professional communities of practice by Grossman, Weinberg, and Woolworth. And so here I highlight 3 of the things that need to happen in order to establish effective professional communities. The first is establishing a group identity and norms for interaction. We believe that asking our educators what matters to them and having a core, an advisory core, fulfills the beginning of this requirement. Also formulating a sense of communal responsibility. The monthly talks are organized by us, we coordinate them, but our speakers are people from the network who have domain knowledge in something that is of interest to the group: diversity, equity, inclusion, collaboration, etc. And also, third, members need to assume responsibility for their colleagues' growth and development. So this is a third step that we're working on, and it's a part of our future directions. But one of the things that we think could be beneficial in joining our 2 networks, GrowPulse and the Pulse T network, is that there's an overlap in interest. So we are interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so are physics high school students. We can envision a collaborative partnership where we have a number of high school physics educators who care about specific research domains, who reach out to the GrowPulse network, for example, and ask for help in designing a study or helping with assessment. So with that, I'm happy to take your questions about our early efforts, and I'm excited to hear your comments. Thank you.
Let's thank our speakers, Dr. Mazur and Ms. Gallegos. And the floor is open for any questions. Please type them into the chat box and I will read them out.
Can I just say one thing fast?
Mm-hmm.
Here, interaction between the two networks. I'm sorry, I was going to type, but one thing Margaret may want to comment, and I think add to your last comment about interactions between the physics of living system network and the physics of living system teachers network, is the idea we have this program at CTVP where undergrads come for research in the summer and they are assigned to one of our graduate students or postdocs, they work with us. Maybe we could expand the entire PoLS network and we can bring teachers into the summer to do research. And Margaret's around it. Maybe you guys want to comment a little bit about it, since that's a good topic of discussion.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in. I see Margaret is walking from one room to the other and settling in there. So the NSF actually has a program that mirrors the RU program. Instead of being research experience for undergraduates, it's research experience for teachers. And for many, many years, I'm the PI on one of the Harvard RU programs. And for many years, we included teachers. So in my group, for example, I've had a series of high school teachers who came to the research, usually research in optics, and sometimes research in physics education research. But so there's already an avenue to do that, but I think this would be definitely a great way of having PoLS, support the development of teachers. And there are certainly this summer in the workshop, we heard from quite a few teachers that they would like to update their knowledge and keep current. So I think that's a great idea. I don't know if Margaret wants to add to that, or Isa.
Just a sec. I think that's a great idea. With a STEP program that Greg is going to talk about later in the next, that the exposure of research could be just like 2 hours or 1 hour per day, that the teacher get to see what's happening. I think they are communicators. They are great in translating what we are doing in the lab and then communicate that with the students. So I think that expectation of an RET will perhaps has to discuss with the teachers that what do they want to do with their given amount of time, because you're very busy. Thank you.
But maybe in the summer, Margaret, if we can find some financial support for them during that time, they can actually work and do something on the lab and sort of really improve basically their personally that, and that transmit all that inspiration to the students. We have to think about it. I'm not an expertise on that. You and Eric can tell me more about it, what we can do.
Certainly.
Right, we have a lively discussion in the chat, but I think some of the questions have been answered. We have a question from Greg Morrison, who asks, do you find that most students do engage with the material in the flipped classroom? What do you do if they do not engage?
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking that, Greg. The answer is, certainly I find that most students engage. You see, think about the lecture method. How do you know whether or not students engage, right? I mean, essentially you're looking at a sea of faces and it's really very hard to see what is going on in their brain. But anyway, let's just ignore that for now. Let's talk about the engagement. And I presume you mean the engagement with the material before coming to class. So initially, I focused really on the in-class experience, and to me, the engagement that was sort of, or the transfer of information, if I may use that term, was a trivial part of education. I didn't spend much time on it. I did do, however, find that a fraction of the student would happily come to class, not having done anything. And my initial reaction to that was exactly the wrong reaction. You know, I would come to class, I would notice that a significant fraction of the student had not done their pre-class assignment, and then I say, oh my God, what am I going to do now? You know what, let's take 10 minutes to essentially tell them what they should have read, only to discover that it is exactly the wrong thing to do. because now you're telling the students who don't prepare themselves, don't worry, if you don't do it, Professor Mazur will tell you in 10 minutes what would have taken you a lot longer to do. And you're telling the students who have put in the effort, you fools, you've been wasting your time. And the next time nobody comes to class prepared. So the one thing, the maybe most direct answer to your question is do nothing. Right? I mean, you have to, in a sense, address your own expectations before you address those of your students. And think about it. Think about it. Think back of when you were a student. And think not of the courses in the discipline that you were majoring in, but some other courses you had to take as a requirement. Anything, right? Did you come to class prepared and read the material before class? I'd be really surprised if, you know, for 100% of the lectures you read before. And frankly, I'm not afraid of admitting that publicly, I read 0 before class. Was that because I was lazy or not motivated or because I couldn't read? No. The reason was very simple. I'd be curious to see if somebody has an answer to that. Why did we, when we were students, not read systematically before coming to class? I mean, yeah, I think the answer is pretty simple. The answer is there was no need to, because the professor was reading the book to us, right? I mean, if you read beforehand, you had to sit through hearing what you had read before. So that shows that, you know, the first thing we have to do is change our behavior before we can change the behavior of our students. So that's one thing. In more recent years, however, the past 6 or 7 years, I've started to use a social learning platform, Perusal, and for full disclosure, we developed that. We developed it to solve a problem in my class, and then found that people got interested in it. Now there's something like 1.2 million students using it worldwide, which essentially turns the out-of-class reading or watching, because you can use it with video too, step into a social experience where students can help each other and exchange information with each other. And I've seen a significant uptake in the engagement with the material before class. Is this a trivial matter? As I said in the beginning, no, it's not. And there are many little steps you need to take in order to really make it click. And one is to change the motivation of the students. You know, I've had some students really resist this whole flipping the classroom, right? I mean, I'd had this student a number of years ago who wrote me in I think in week 2 or 3 of the class, this vicious email. Okay, it started with the subject concerns. And then he said, "Dear Professor Mazur, I speak on behalf of many of my classmates." And so on, you know, very well articulated message. And he said, you know, while I enjoy the interactive questions in class, you know, he thought that, you know, because this is the other thing, right? In a lecture, you're not aware of what you do and don't understand. But once you start answering questions, it's in your face as a student, right? Now, all of a sudden you discover during class time, oh my God, I don't understand this. What do I do if I get a question like this on the exam? So it's much more in your face. And that was clearly very disconcerting to him. So he said that, you know, while he enjoyed the questions, you know, he thought that I think that you should, and then essentially lectures that what you were saying, go over the reading point by point in class. So anyway, I invited him to my office, and I said, look, I showed him the data that you saw at the beginning of the gain when I was lecturing and the gain when I was, after I implemented peer instruction. And I said, look, do you want to be there or do you want to be there? And so he looked at it, but by the end of the conversation, it was very clear that I had not convinced him at all. So I said, let me make you a deal. I have a blackboard in my office, just as, you know, very similar to the blackboard in the classroom. I said, if you want, you can come once a week to my office and I'll write the notes on the blackboard and then you can copy them in your notebook. So he got a big smile on his face, but, you know, that didn't convince me. And luckily he did not pick me up on my offer. But then something curious happened, you know. He actually all of a sudden latched onto the method, and he saw the benefits of it, and he saw it's, you know, in a sense, changing our approach to teaching is like cleaning up a closet you've neglected a long time where things have piled up. As you begin cleaning up, the mess becomes bigger, not smaller, right? And it takes a while before things are getting back in order. And so he latched on, and he ended up being the top scoring student in the class. In fact, I was so excited by his reasoning skills. I saw his final exam, and I thought, this student needs to be a physics major. So I asked him to, and he actually sent me an email, you know, thank you, right after final exam. I don't know if I'll get an A or an A minus, but I want you to know you're the best professor I've ever had, blah, 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 and so on. And anyway, so I invited him to my office, and I said, you should really consider becoming a physics major. I couldn't talk him out of becoming a surgeon, and we need some smart surgeons too. So I'm quite all right with that. So we need to, you know, change is difficult, and we need to work on it, and we need to prepare people for change, not only instructors, but students as well. Thank you for the question. Sorry for the rambling answer.
Thank you. Related to pre-med physics majors or physics students, Monica Makura would like to know, could you comment on the types of physics problems that these college students such as pre-meds are solving? I recently thought about it, and I wondered whether there are topics in physiology that could be used to teach physics as opposed to typical problems of two cars hitting each other and so on. Do you think how the concepts are framed by using specific examples matters?
Absolutely. You know, in fact, at the workshop, we had one of my former group members, Catherine Crouch, present on using physics related to the life sciences to teach introductory physics. I think many of the examples that we use in our physics courses date back to the turn of the century, not 20th to 21st, no, 19th, 20th, sorry, the turn of the previous century. And I don't think they're optimum to motivate anyone. And I think helping students to develop a more intrinsic reason for study is very important than simply having an extrinsic motivation through grades. And one of the ways of doing that is by framing the problems that we give them, by framing the projects. That's why I try to have this wrapper around my projects that puts my projects in a societal context, in the context of a societal problem. I absolutely, but you know, here's the big problem, right? You can pick any random textbook, and there are lots of cars colliding and balls rolling down incline. There are very few examples of problems in a life science context. So developing more material in a context that's more relevant to our students, I think will go a long way towards motivating people for our discipline, which I won't have any need to convince you, I think is at the heart of doing science.
Thank you. There's a question from Vernita Gordon, who says, I've recently finished a 3-year project in which I compared outcomes for an introductory mechanics course, comparing peer instruction through small group discussions versus interactive lectures, that is me with the class as a whole. I found that peer instruction was associated with worse outcomes for URMs, first generation low-income students, also worse outcomes for students with below median SAT scores. I'm heartbroken about this. I suspect that this may arise from the very high level of heterogeneity in prior background in my physics classroom, from UT Austin's unique admissions policy, plus I'm teaching a class for physics majors, but most of the students are non-physics majors. Hurting underrepresented disadvantaged students by using peer instruction was the last thing I wanted. This isn't really a question, but do you have anything to say about this?
I have a lot to say about this. In fact, I had one of my former graduate students, she's now on the faculty at Tufts write her thesis about the effect of peer instruction on underrepresented minorities. You see, back in the, I think, late 90s, we did research on how peer instruction helped close the gender achievement gap, not by getting the males down and the women up, no, by getting both up, pulling up the female students disproportionately, so that the initial gap at the beginning of the term became no longer statistically significant at the end of the term. And that immediately gave the idea to also look for Hispanic and Black African-American students to see what the effect was on those two groups. And just like you, we found that that for Hispanic and African-American students, the effect was, not there. There was no closing of the gap. And in part, we attributed that to the fact that the grouping in peer instruction is completely self-selected, right? I mean, you sit next to the, in a classroom, we had no I don't know how it is in your classroom, certainly in our classroom, we didn't tell students where to sit and who to talk to. We tried it one year and students didn't take kindly there. They said, we want to determine who we talk to and where we sit. So I think that the self-selected grouping is actually detrimental. So Isa and I are now working on a different approach. We still use peer instruction, but it's folded inside team-based learning. And we actually control, this is one of Isa's research project as a doctoral student at Harvard, to actually look how to optimize working in teams and how to form teams and how to find a way of getting people in a team to work together better and learn from each other better. And there we control the teams, we form the teams. And certainly diversity is important. And which is actually, maybe Isa, you want to say a little bit more about it because it fits the theme of this conference so well. And what is happening in society around us is, is clearly showing that this is important. Teaching people how to work with each other is something that is typically not done either at the secondary or at the post-secondary level, but it's crucially important for how society functions. So what I want to say is that now what we do is we are actually controlling who works together, who talks together, and we find actually, I think, a higher gain. It's too early to really say, but we find a bigger benefit to underrepresented minorities.
Yeah, I can add something to that if it's okay. Another way that we're starting to look at our data, and this is in the initial stages, is dividing the groups depending on the kinds of learning goals or performance goals they have. So we still look into ethnicity, but one of the things that we're exploring is if we have a couple of subsets of students where their learning trajectory looks quite different depending on the goals they have initially. And we think this might have implications for students who are underrepresented, where students who are underrepresented and have learning goals tend to do better than students who are underrepresented and have performance goals in the class.
Okay, let's thank our speakers again, and thank you everyone for the lively discussion.
Thank you.
I can already see some collaborations being formed through the chat window, and we can continue this through the Slack channel. Our next speaker is Dr. Greg Morrison, who is an assistant professor of physics at the University of Houston, where he works on applying tools from statistical physics and network theory to understand biological systems. Before starting his lab at the University of Houston, Dr. Morrison got his PhD in physics from the University of Maryland in College Park, co-terps. In addition to his biophysics research, Dr. Morrison is the co-director of the STEM Teacher Equity Project for Physics, or STEP, which trains high school physics teachers in taking an inquiry-based pedagogical style to their classroom teaching. We will now hear about this program from Dr. Morrison.
Hi, my name is Greg Morrison. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Houston in the Department of Physics. And today I'm going to be talking about a project that I was working that I was previously involved in, a collaboration between physics and education departments at the University of Houston, called the STEM Physics Equity Project, or STEP Physics, directed at improving education outcomes for underprepared teachers in high needs districts. So let me first give a sense of why it is that such a program is even needed. So it's been well recognized that in the United States there is a high need for well-trained STEM teachers in primary and secondary education. So this perhaps the first significant call for a national program was in 2007 with the National Academies of Sciences Rising Above the Gathering Storm, where it was noted that in physics and chemistry, an enormous fraction of teachers do not have certification in the courses that they teach. And so over the past decade, there has been a push to improve the ratio of teachers that are certified and do have a degree in the course that they teach. However, improvement has only been modest in the past 10 to 15 years. So this is, we could see that in 2013, this was on the order of 45%. And in 2015, we can see that well over half of students had a teacher that did not have a degree in physics, had a physics teacher that did not have a degree in physics. And fully a third had a teacher that had even no certification in physics. And so one of the main thrusts to address this issue is to train new teachers and put them in a position where they are, where they do enter the education workforce. And so there are a number of excellent programs that exist both at University of Houston and across the country. UTeach being a primary example, and Teach Houston being our version of UTeach. So these programs are excellent. However, it is often the case that these highly qualified teachers go to districts with resources. And in Texas and across the country, historically underserved school districts suffer a significant gap in the resources they have available per student. And so this is a particular recent in 2019 estimate of on the order of $1,000 less per student in a highly diverse school than a primarily white school district. I was actually surprised whenever I read this, because this is actually not bad in comparison to the rest of the country, which to me is an even more shocking figure. But in Texas, this was something that we recognized was important to address. And this gap in education outcomes can also be seen in the performance on standardized tests such as the ACT. And so this graph shows the percent of students that performed sufficiently well on the ACT STEM benchmarks, given that they had, given the number of diversity indicator, given the number of disadvantaged diversity indicators. So this includes racial statistics as well as financial statistics, and with 0 of these disadvantaged indicators, the performance was, so clearly 50% is not stellar, but is still a significant improvement over these other over the presence of having more than one of these indicators. And so this attrition rate increases the more of these indicators that one has. Now, this is a problem in the Houston area and across the country, but this is a particular example. Here, this school district is primarily is 1/3 non-white, while this school district, Aldine, is 98% white. Right. The difference, is 98% non-white. Here, this school district is 1/3 white versus essentially 0% white. The students here, the populations are comparable. example. The poverty rate is higher in this district, and the the money per student is significantly lower for the more diverse than the lower poverty district. Right. So this is not something that any individual university, any individual outreach program can address. Right. There's no way for us to solve the financing problems of the current education system in the United States. What we can do is recognize that this need exists and approach these school districts, work with them to try to improve the abilities of the teachers that currently exist in those districts. Right? So this is a second path to try to promote equitable knowledge, equitable teaching skills in all school districts. And so what was done at the University of Houston, we came up with something called the STEP Physics Program. This is the STEM Teaching Equity Project. This was essentially a 2-week summer program coupled with a year-long set of lessons, 120 hours of training in total over the entire year, covering either the first semester of physics or the second semester of physics. So Newton's laws, kinematics, conservation of energy in the first year, and electrostatics, optics, and these sorts of things in the second year. This program was taught using active learning techniques, which is something I'm going to describe in just a moment. We targeted underrepresented, underprepared teachers in districts where a high fraction of demographically disadvantaged students were found. So this included, for instance, a high fraction of school lunch programs. And so in particular, you can see the strangely shaped district that I had just showed you is I believe this one. Let's see. This was led. So these sessions were led by faculty from the Department of Physics, faculty or graduate students from the College of Education at the University of Houston, as well as involvement of expert teachers in the school districts themselves. So active teaching techniques is one of the important components of the STEP Physics program. And so I want to briefly talk about why it is that we focused on teaching them active learning techniques as opposed to traditional lecture. Right? So a traditional lecture, I would explain the underlying physics, and then and you would watch me write this on a whiteboard or a chalkboard, and then the students would go home, do the homework, and that would be the first time that they themselves are interacting with the problem, right? The first time that they encounter having to think through the actual process and not just watch me do it is when I'm not in the room, when I cannot possibly help them, right? And so active learning essentially asks the students to be engaged during the lecture. And so the students will be asked questions, they'll have to respond to prompts, they'll have to talk to other students about the answers that they gave to those prompts, and they'll have to creatively interpret whatever they're given. So in some cases, this will be a set of questions, in some cases, this will be a set of experiments, right? But given this, it has been shown in a variety of publications that these active learning techniques are significantly beneficial in comparison to traditional lecture techniques, right? So this is one particular example. These are the same set of classes. These are the percent change in the failure rate of students with active learning in a variety of STEM classes. So essentially, fewer students fail if one takes an active learning approach as opposed to a traditional lecture approach. This is the distribution of the fractions of students that failed. And what we essentially can see is that there is a significant improvement on the order of a 50% risk ratio, there's 50% improvement in the failure rate of students in these classes if active learning is used. Right. Students that are involved in active learning, this IDL stands for Interactive Lecture Demonstration. And once again, so this IDL means that, that active learning techniques were used. The question here was, IDL helps me understand a concept better. And this is a list of concepts that were asked about. And overwhelmingly, the students agreed that the active learning techniques did help them understand the concept. Okay. And so I want to give a couple of very brief examples of active learning techniques to hopefully give you a sense of why these things are useful, and also hopefully to make sure that you are currently awake. So one example are these conceptual questions, right? So in a conceptual question, I am going to first review the topics that we have already discussed to make sure that you are recalling relevant knowledge that you already have, but that you yourself have encountered in previous lectures. I'm then going to ask you a multiple choice question, and I'm going to give you the chance to answer that anonymously. Now, the anonymity matters quite a bit because some students that are struggling do not want to raise their hands. In fact, many students don't want to raise their hands, even if they're doing well. But having this anonymous means that all students are able to participate. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to first point out that hopefully we're all reasonably familiar with centrifugal motion, but this is centrifugal force and centripetal motion. Right? The centripetal force is inward, the centrifugal force is outward. So if I'm driving in a car and I steer to the left, I move to the right. If I am driving in a car and I decelerate, I am pushed forward. If I am driving in a car and I accelerate, I am pushed backwards. Right? So there's a difference in the force that is felt by me in the car and the direction of the motion. So we imagine now that you are familiar with centrifugal force, and now I'm going to ask you a multiple choice question. Now, I'm not going to say anything for the next 45 seconds. You're going to have 45 seconds to answer this. There's going to be a poll that appears either in front of your screen or in the chat box. But there's going to be a poll where you're going to have the opportunity to answer this conceptual question. Okay, so here we go. So only 15 seconds left. So if you have no idea, pick something. Okay, so we've hit time, and so hopefully you put something into the poll. Okay. Now, one thing to point out, again, it's important for this to be anonymous so that every student will commit. Because the commitment really matters. The student buying into the question, buying into the thought process, and picking something means that they are more likely to care about the outcome, right? Than if I were to just tell them the answer. Now, normally, if this were in person, I would ask you to convince your neighbor that you're right, and I would point out that just because you and your neighbor agree doesn't make you right. Of course, this is an asynchronous talk right now. It's pre-recorded, so I cannot do that. And generally speaking, I would give you a few minutes to talk, and then I would ask people to re-vote. And particularly if there was a large fraction correct, right? If 90% get the answer right, there's no reason to re-vote. But if it's an even 33% across all three answers, well, it's valuable to re-vote. Okay, and then after the re-vote, typically I would tell you the answer, and so that's what we're going to do here. This is a video of a car turning to the left. You can see that the balloon is moving to the left. The person would be feeling a centrifugal force to the right. And so this is actually a demonstration of what's called the equivalence principle. This is a very nice example of, you can see that he turned to the right, I'm sorry, over here, and the balloon moved as well. This demonstrates that forces are equivalent, right? So there's nothing special about the gravitational force, right? The gravity pulls air down and the balloon moves up relative to the air. In the car, the exact same thing is true. The air feels a centrifugal force to the right whenever the car is turning to the left, and so the balloon moves to the left. Okay, so this is one example of how this can be demonstrated. Another class of problems that we do in active learning are inquiry style learning, where the students build an experiment. Right? So one of the first ways that students typically are going to encounter the idea of magnetic induction is through a picture something along these lines, right? This is a complicated looking figure. There's a lot of moving parts, but we imagine generally that we have current moving through this loop. The loop is put inside of in between two poles of a magnet. That creates a magnetic field. Because of the moving charge, that causes a torque on the loop, which can be converted into mechanical work, right? This is sort of a classic collection of problems. These are difficult to understand on a page, right? The student has to, first of all, be confident about what's being said about torque. They need to use the right-hand rule in order to do this, which students always have a problem with. And then there are even unfamiliar terms in this picture that we've never talked about in class, these brushes and metal slip rings, right? And so in inquiry physics, essentially we hand them the tools to build something along these lines, but don't tell them necessarily exactly what to do. Instead, we give guidance. We suggest how to build a simple device, and I'll give an example in a moment. After that, we ask the students what-if questions. What if we vary this or that? And the students then are able to determine some underlying principle. So as an example, this is an example of an inquiry experiment. So I've got a metal screw with some string tied around it, neodymium magnets, unshielded copper wire, and something to cut the wire with, as well as a AA battery. Right. This experiment is very inexpensive. The batteries are $1. The magnets are $1, and essentially this can be shared. This experimental the elements of this experiment can be easily found in any hardware store or on Amazon, right? And all of these elements can be used for other experiments as well. Okay, so we're going to take these elements and we're going to perform the following experiment. Stretch a wire. I'm just going to clip a piece of wire, and what I'm going to do is essentially create the homopolar motor that was described, or something similar to the homopolar motor that was described in the textbook. But I'm going to do it in such a way that you don't need the right-hand rule to understand what's going on. You don't have to have a sense of torque. This is just essentially, we're going to see the torque happening without having to design anything complicated, right? So the magnet is on the bottom, that magnetizes the metal screw. That means that I can attach that to the battery. Now here, basically, I'm going to show you this. That's the piece of wire I just cut. Instead, I'm just going to use the one that I practiced with so that I make sure that the experiment goes well. I touch this to the top and the bottom, and hopefully you can see that here the screw is spinning. You can see more clearly because the string is spinning around. This demonstrates exactly the same principle. There's an asymmetry in the magnetic field. In this particular loop, so in this experiment, only half of the loop is closed. But there's an asymmetry in the magnetic field, and that's what's giving rise to the torque. Right? There's a number of experiments that you could do using this sort of approach, and these things can be done at home. In fact, this setup part could be done asynchronously, although the full inquiry lesson does require that you can interact with the students, but that can be done online. Okay, so there are a number of these benefits of active techniques. So there are, hopefully this convinces you that there are statistically significant, meaningful measures of improvement. And hopefully the previous two slides at least gave you a sense that, well, that could be fun, right? That could be engaging and possibly help you understand some physical principles, right? So why doesn't everyone do this? Well, the reason why is because it's hard. Right? It's difficult for us, the teachers, to learn how to do this well because we weren't taught this way typically. And the students themselves also have to struggle in class. They have to think about the answers to things. They have to talk to each other. And so students tend to do well in the active learning classes, right? That's what this this darker bar essentially says. This is statistically significant improvement. However, this is statistically significant decrease in sort of happiness, of satisfaction with the lecture. You feel like you're not doing as well because you're struggling more. Right. So it's important for high school, for secondary school teachers to have the ability to practice this, right? So what we've done in the STEP program is we teach them not only the content knowledge, and here we're showing essentially the improvements in content knowledge of these teachers that pass through the STEP program. But we also teach them about the outcome, the pedagogy that allows this improved teaching method to be brought into their classrooms, right? There's a number of advantages as well for the University of Houston. We invite we invite high schoolers to come to the University of Houston, and that sometimes is the first time they've ever even thought about coming to college, and it may be UH. We also, all of our faculty that participate in this program now have some experience with active learning techniques as well, and many have brought it into their own classrooms. One other thing to point out, in these high needs districts, these teachers are often overworked, and we need to, in order to recruit these participants, we need to make it clear what they get out of the program, right? The STEP program satisfied all the state requirements for professional training. We gave them the kits, and so all of the neodymium magnets, we would hand them those kits. They can bring it into their classroom directly, along with the lesson plans that they use to learn this stuff. And then finally, we do give them a stipend for their participation, because this is 120 hours. That's a lot to ask anyone to give up for free. Right? So finally, I just want to thank everyone that organized this. The STEP Physics program was originally conceived by Margaret Chung, Wallace Dominy, and Rebecca Forrest, and they were integral to this. Faculty in the physics department at the University of Houston really played a big role in making this a successful program, as well as all of the teachers and school districts that were willing to participate and be involved. And I want to also thank you for your time, and I look forward to talking to you in a moment.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison, for a fun interactive talk. If anyone has questions, please type them into the chat.
I have a kind of a meta question, maybe not metaphysical, but a meta question.
Sure.
One of the things that I noticed, in fact, in the example that was shown, I think one of the problems of relating to, when I try to teach anyway, to people is I like to use real world examples and move up to some kind of problem that is in the real world. But one of the problems is that the real world is very complicated. Many times your first impression of what the answer is wrong. It's not because the laws of physics are wrong, but you haven't applied them in enough stages. So I kind of worry a little bit about this idea that one can more or less directly learn everything by doing experiments and asking questions without going through those multiple levels of analysis. I thought the example with the balloon was a very clear one. I think we got lots of answers from well-trained physicists that were showing that we had no idea which way the balloon was supposed to move. And I think that shows that we're professionals. That we understand that there's many steps in this process. Is it going to be that the air is the biggest effect, or is it going to be that the balloon is the biggest effect? Is it going to be, so there's all kinds of stuff like that. And I think that meta lesson is important for people to learn, but I think it's hard to communicate it. Yeah.
It is very difficult to communicate these things. And it is helpful to have, I'm afraid I didn't cite the book that some of these questions come out of, but there are a number, in physics education research, there are a number of people who are actively looking to determine what are good questions. What kinds of questions can you ask that address this hierarchy of sort of knowledge? Because, one level is that the balloon moves, of course, and the next level is the direction of the motion, and then the next level is the cause of that direction of motion, right? And so these different levels of hierarchy are something that with active learning, you try to draw out of the students themselves. But you do need a well-designed question, I think. And that is hard to do, but there are people that are thinking about this. I'll try to find the citation for this and include
that. Would be great. I see this problem more in chemistry, where especially I ask introductory people, I've taught introductory chemistry for non-science majors, but not for science majors. Okay. And when I've listened to people who teach it for science majors, they often say, oh, here's an interesting problem. And then they say, here's the answer that I expect the students to have. And I say, that's a wonderful answer. It's just wrong. And it just happens all the time. Now, that's because chemistry is more complex than certain parts of physics, and biology is more complex than chemistry, and biological physics is sort of a thing that tries to build these together. So I'm a little it just seems like a question people should be spending time trying to think about. I don't know how to answer it with the social experiments or anything, but it seems like an issue.
Peter, this is Dave. How do you deal with that then when you know it's not correct, but you want to transmit something to the freshman, for example? How do you deal with that?
I have this problem with honesty. And I usually say, this is what some people will tell you. And then I explain why this is not really right and why I won't be able to explain the right answer to you. I don't get good teaching ratings, so it's not, so if the goal of this is to get good teaching ratings, I think there's a problem. On the other hand, I've had a few students say, like in the non-majors class, oh, that's the first class I ever had, as far as they were concerned, like someone who told them the straight truth to the extent you know it, but left some questions unanswered. Maybe Eric Mazur has more to say about this kind of question. It must come up at Harvard all the time.
I typed in some thoughts in the chat, but while you were engaged in discussion, I think it really all boils down to whether one wants to teach the content of physics or really more physics as a way of thinking. Right. And you know, one of the big problems and the big traps that we physicists fall into continuously is to think of our students as mini-me's, as, you know, people who are going to become like us. Most of them will not. You know, I think 99% of students in an introductory physics course are not going to be physicists. They have a very different motivation for taking a physics course than we had, and they probably will have very different interests too. So what is more important is it that we educate the 0.5% who will be like us and who will make it through whichever way we teach, or will we focus on the 99.5% who are not going to be professors of physics and who generally have very different needs, who will probably forget most of what we teach, just like we forgot most of what we learned in courses that were not in our major field. So I'm starting to believe more and more that we should teach physics as a way of thinking, as a process, rather than you know, just a content, really like a reasoning skill, which is useful outside of the boundaries of our discipline, and which could add value to whatever career our students are taking. And in that respect, I think content becomes much less relevant, and we can actually focus on actively engaging the mind the way Greg was describing.
I think there's also value in that. One of the goals that we must have when interacting with high school is improving just broadly scientific literacy, right? Just a sense of, you know, what physics is and how the world works. And these conceptual ideas, I think, are much more useful for improving scientific literacy than throwing an equation at them and you know, oh, well, why is it 1/2 AT squared? Oh, you know, that can introduce confusion that is not fundamentally necessary to understanding force balance or any of these things, right? The concepts, I think, can be taught more effectively than the math in many cases.
So, Greg, many of these people teaching physics are not physics majors, right? The teachers have other majors. How do you deal with that on the context of when you train them?
Again, it's so the approach that we take is because of this inquiry style. Some of the teachers come in already knowing sort of the answer, right? So if we take the example of DC circuits, right? Some people know, generally speaking, if you connect a light bulb versus 2 light bulbs, that increases the resistance. And some teachers know what's going to happen, but others simply do not, right? And so we ask them to build these things, to build these circuits, predict what's going to happen. And sometimes they can understand, sometimes the prediction is correct, sometimes incorrect, which is exactly the experience that they have with their students. And so because we give them the supplies, the kits that they've already learned from, they've experienced the struggle of actually figuring this stuff out. And so even if they don't have a background in physics, they're able to take not only the knowledge they've learned from doing the experiment, but also the experience of struggling with the experiment to more effectively teach it within their classrooms. Now, all that being said, we do tell them about Ohm's law. In the end, we do write down the math, and so they're also able to talk about the mathematics, but the concepts are where we start, and that is more helpful to those that have less experience in physics.
All right, we have time for one more question, preferably from a student.
So I did the whole STEP program, and first of all, it was amazing. I think I learned so much from it. And anybody who has not done it, anybody who will, if you need help to like spread the word, I want to definitely help spread that word. But I did want to make one very quick comment. I think another problem we have in physics is, even at the high school level, I teach high school physics, right? Is whenever we say conceptual physics, there's this assumption that conceptual physics is the lower level of physics classes you'll take, right? Like, and I think that causes a problem because conceptual physics actually is tougher because it's not a math course, it is a physics course at the end of the day, right? To actually get to the depth. So, but what do we do about the fact that students come in like, oh, conceptual physics, this is supposed to be an easy class. Mathematics, it's supposed to be a hard one. Like, is that something STEP has thought about, or?
Well, so the evidence related to exams says that, so the students in the active learning and passive learning classes always take the same exams in all of these studies. And so you learn just as much math in principle. So there may be additional things you learn in a passive lecture that's more mathematical than you do in an active lesson. But the mathematics required for understanding the underlying physics, the content knowledge that you learn is greater than or equal to in active learning and passive learning, right? So because these are the same exams, it's not like we're only asking them questions about conceptual things. They also learn the math. With active learning, generally, the idea is to get to the concept first and then do the math. And that is often not the way that it is presented in a passive lecture. Right? A passive lecture, you're standing at a whiteboard and it's hard to sketch a concept, right? But it's very easy to write an equation. And so I would say that convincing the student, so it is hard to convince the students, and this is something that Dr. Mazur was talking about, essentially trying to convince, trying to use data to convince a student that this is to their benefit. And sometimes you won't be able to. But when talking to a student that is uncertain, it's, I think, useful to explain that we're still going to do the same things, we're doing it in a different order, right? We want concept first. I want you to understand the underlying physics so that we can build off of that instead of trying to understand the math from the beginning.
All right, we'll do one quick last question from Karim Mehrabiani. How do you teach students to formulate questions at different levels of abstraction? Is there a general method or does it vary with the personality of the student? What if students don't know how to formulate questions verbally?
So when it comes to these experiments, so with the motor experiment. So first of all, there are multiple different kinds of motor experiments that one could use. I actually had to clip one of the motor experiments. And so if my explanation of the particular origin of the torque was a little unclear, it referred to a different experiment that wasn't actually presented. So I apologize for that. Let's see, so the goal with inquiry learning is to force the students to be actually engaged, hands-on, trying to answer a question. But it's also important for the teacher to be the one asking the questions and trying to guide them to get to the answer. And so if you have a student that is that has a difficult time verbalizing, first, it's important for them to be working in groups and for you to stop by these groups and try to engage with them, right? Every student should say something out loud to you or to their group members, right? The other question was, and whether or not it varies student to student, it absolutely does. Some students, all of us have this experience in our classrooms. Some students are really just naturally fantastic. They know, they just have a sense of what's going on, and others struggle. And it is important to try to engage with the talented and struggling students, and you need to do so in different ways. And one way, so when it comes to speaking to struggling students, the idea of anonymity is helpful, because so this is one of the values of the conceptual questions, right? But whenever it comes to these little mini experiments, you can talk to that student individually, where it's not, they're not in front of a big crowd, right? You're talking to just them in front of one or two other people. And so it's less intimidating and you are engaging directly with them. But overall, the idea is to ask leading questions and get them, and try to lead them to an answer that addresses the underlying physics.
All right, let's thank Dr. Morrison again.
Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Ms. Celestina Pangan, who is currently a teacher at Chavez High School in Houston, and she's also pursuing a master's degree in physics with an emphasis on teaching at Texas A&M University at Commerce. She has taught several STEM classes, physics, chemistry, biology, and forensic science, and has over 22 years of teaching experience. Ms. Pangan holds a bachelor's degree in secondary education from Universidad de Santa Isabel in the Philippines, a Master of Arts degree in science education with a focus on physics from the Western Governors University. And she will talk to us about her journey teaching physics at a Title I school.
I'm Celestina. I will talk about my transformative journey teaching in a Title I school. First, let us define what a Title I school is. Title I school is federally funded, serves high numbers of economically disadvantaged children. Federal funds assist schools in meeting the educational needs of students living near or at poverty levels. Its goals are to ensure that high-risk students meet at least the minimum proficiency on state academic standards and assessments, and that they have a fair opportunity to earn high-quality education. Who are my students? My students are classified as at risk, recent immigrants, first-generation graduates, and they are also dreamers. The at-risk students, these are students who are requiring temporary or ongoing intervention to succeed academically. They usually belong to dysfunctional family. They are usually homeless. They're helping parents to pay bills. They usually work full-time job. They are teenage parents, gang members, drug users or dealers, juvenile delinquent, and some of them are suffering mental health problems such as depression. While our recent immigrants, these are the English language learners who required a lot of assistance to succeed in the US classroom, where the medium of instruction is English, and the school culture may be different from their home country. First-generation graduates are classified, are students who are the first in the family to graduate from high school. And our students are also dreamers. They have big dreams, just like their non-Title I school peers. Hence, they need the same quality of preparation to chase their dreams and compete globally. What are my challenges being in a Title I school? There are challenges that teachers face in their school. The challenges I face may not be unique at all, and these are scarce learning resources. And if there's scarce learning resources, learning will be limited as well. Student motivation. The lack of it is a lingering challenge, I think, by any teacher. And again, it may not be unique to my situation. The class size. The teacher to student ratio is a problem in a Title I school. There was even an instance that I had to inform my assistant principal to not add students in one class because I no longer had desks for them, meaning the class is already beyond capacity. We face this problem due to an inadequate number of teachers teaching the class, particularly physics class. Not having a lab classroom or being a floater is also another challenge that I face. There were times I had to be in a 10 by 10 classroom. This is 10 meter by 10 meter classroom with 30 plus students. So the space is not ideal for labs or hands-on activities. Hence, I always have to be strategic all the time in the use of space in my classroom. At one point, I was a floater, thus it was more challenging to go from one classroom to another, especially if there was a scheduled hands-on activities. So what my students taught or teach me? They taught me compassion, creativity, resourcefulness, motivation. For compassion, I define it as empathy with action. As I witness the ugly situations my students are in, I learned to develop compassion, understanding for, and rapport with them. Because of this, helping them to be academically successful became much easier. Identifying the difficulty my students are facing helps me provide the proper interventions so they become successful in my class. Creativity. With the challenges I face regarding limited learning resources, rather than making it a source of frustration, I designed lessons that would motivate student learning. When I had no lab room, I would use the hallway, or I would take my students outside the building to have their activities. I did not allow these barriers to impede the learning of my students. Resourcefulness. Resourcefulness with time is when students are needing tutorials, I would be available for them during lunchtime or during after school. If the learning materials is scarce, I would make my students rotate so everyone can perform the activity. At times, I would spend out of my own pocket to buy materials I would need for activities. Yes, I must allocate budget for these materials, but so long as my students learn from the activities, I think it is worth the money spent. Motivation. As I learn more about my students and their needs, they motivate me to go the extra mile, to look for and attend professional development specific to the subject I teach, or simply learning new things. This can be a new skill or a new teaching strategy. I will do this so I can provide them quality education and learning in my classroom, and I also want to prepare them to post-secondary education. So how did Title I school transform me? I aspire for my own growth and development by constant desire to improve my practice every year, if not every day. A more reflective practitioner to offer a better version of myself to my students, and the students motivate me so I can motivate them. Although Title I school elicited my transformation, this would not happen if there are no opportunities available to me. They said a teacher whose learning supports student learning. I am eager to learn, so when I could not find content-specific professional development, I would look for ways to improve my classroom management and my pedagogy for effective learning. When I finally found a professional development that concentrated on physics education through University of Houston STEM Teaching Equity program, I transformed 360 degrees. Hence, I can say that the program played a very significant role in my transformation. I was able to improve my practice and provided rich learning experience to my students. The year-long program enhanced my understanding of physics concepts, inquiry-based learning, and cooperative learning. The program helped me overcome my dilemma in teaching a material that I lack proper training for, or teach it that will excite students and appreciate physics. In my constant desire to improve my practice, I attended the program with commitment and with dedication because in my mind, the people who will benefit the most are my students. So what am I aiming at in this short talk? I know that there are many teachers out there who are in Title I school teaching physics, who have met the minimum requirement of being science certified teacher, at least in the state of Texas. That's just what you need to do to be able to teach physics class, but do not have proper physics training and perhaps not getting enough help or assistance from colleagues because those teachers are the sole teachers in their respective schools. How will they be reached out? How will this august group of people in this conference be able to reach out to them? Because seriously, the ones who are really affected are the students. I was just lucky to have found the UH STEP on its last 2 years of the program. But had I not moved to Houston, I may still be in limbo teaching physics the way I think I know it, with all my misconceptions or my erroneous understanding of concepts. The following are my students' feedback about the class after receiving the UH STEP year-long professional development. And they are the ones who are benefiting a lot from that change that I had, from that transformation that I had. This opportunity sticks in my mind the most because I really learned the most about methodology and analysis during this project. The class was a great experience overall. Now I'm into my 3rd year of physics, so I think it was worth it. I found it inspiring that you were able to teach us every day while you do your graduate school. Something that I like about physics class were that most of the time it is interactive, whether it was a lab assignment or simply answering questions. It was exciting to learn new concepts in her class because we were able to see fun visual demonstration and conduct students-driven experiment to better visualize and engage in the lesson. I love being able to go to her class and know that at the end of the day, I would have learned something I never knew I could have learned. She provided visuals and presentations, had a lot of projects and activities that were enjoyable and not boring. It gave me hands-on experience through working on lab experience and projects. It made me feel more prepared for future classes and college work. Taking pre-IB physics also helped me open my mind and ask questions about how the world around me works. He always reminded us to do our homework and to make sure we ask questions if we have trouble with our work. You were a very supportive teacher, and I'm glad that I had a teacher like you. Thank you for listening to my brief talk about my transformative journey teaching in a Title I school. I can now answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pangan. Ms. Pangan is an alumna of the STEP physics program, so we can see the program in action through her work. This is very inspiring. Thank you so much. We'd like to now take questions through the chat, and priority will be given to students. So if you type in your question and identify yourself as a student, I will make sure to ask your questions first. While we're waiting for questions, I have a quick question to ask Ms. Pangan. When you go back to your school to teach, how do your interactions with your colleagues go? Do you think one can kind of train their colleagues to also adopt this same teaching methodology that you've learned and adopted?
Thank you for that question. That's a great question. I tried showing it to my colleagues on my on my first year with STEM, I believe. Yeah, I showed them what I was doing with that STEP program. So I even shared to them the different strategies. I said, why don't we just try it so that you can have better engagement with the students? Because you know, your greatest evaluator are your students, not really your appraisers. And students talk. So the tendency of the student is they compare their classes with their peers, and how come you're doing this, and how come in our physics class we're not doing this? So it hurts me to do that. So I would tell my colleagues back then, why don't we try this? Maybe it will help. But again, it depends on the teacher. How I develop myself is because of my own doing, because I want to always be giving the best for my students, a good learning experience or best learning experience in physics, because I never had that great experience in some of my classes. So that's the only goal I have, just to enjoy teaching the kids and at the same time them enjoying learning in my class. And that's why I attended that program with so much dedication, and I was really following to the book what they were asking us as a requirement, and I was doing it. I was even stressing myself over it, because we have an assignment to have to submit, and I have to plan the lesson, and we have to really plan the lesson the way it's supposed to be, applying the knowledge that we got from the training, and at the same time applying the strategies that they are recommending for us. Because to be honest, to get out of your comfort zone is difficult. And sometimes getting out of your comfort zone will benefit the students. Teachers tend to just be within their comfort zone or in their bubble because it's something comfortable, as we said. And, you know, just like the students, we are afraid to fail too. We're scared of that. Yeah.
Thank you. Jonathan Pickett asks, how do you deal with students who do not want to be there at all?
Oh, I really, yeah, I have to call parents. That's another thing. But then again, if you are always giving hands-on activities to the students, something that will really, because these kids, they want to get out, you know, they just want to stand out. They just bored sitting down. So you have to make the physics exciting for them. So they're always looking forward for activities. Every time they enter my classroom, what are we going to do today, miss? They're always asking me that. So sometimes if it is not a hands-on activity, I do demonstrations with them. And in that demonstration, I ask them questions, you know, to start knowing what they know, you know, getting what they know, and, you know, for some what do you call that, their prior knowledge, to get their prior knowledge. And then from there we expand. And then of course there will be some questions like, what? They don't really grasp it. It's really difficult to explain to regular kids about the collision of an object of different mass that they receive the same amount of force. That's difficult for them to understand it, because what they're seeing is not what is the science is explaining. So they're basing their knowledge to what they experience in real life, not what the science that they know of. So that took me a while, especially if you're teaching regular kids. Concept to them is sometimes too much. So how will you dumb it down that you can reach to their level and appreciate the physics?
Thanks. And that's related to Arvind's question, who asks, what techniques do you find useful in solving quantitative problems? I ask this because tests like the SATs are the scores most universities use as proxies for a student's ability.
Okay, yeah. I also, in my regular kids, I told them, I know some of you will not go to college. You're not probably thinking of college, but one day probably you will attend college. So I will just prepare you nonetheless the way I prepare my pre-IB kids and my IB kids. That's what I would tell them. There's always rigor in my class. So there's math. The math, I also teach them manipulation of equation. I explain to them why these variables are moving here and there and what's happening. And then at the same time also explain that equation connected to the concept that we're learning. One scenario we had is when I was explaining to them the collision of two billiard ball, which I actually hang in the classroom. I have to be just creative just to demonstrate that to my students. So I explained it to them, they got the concept, but the moment I threw the math in that concept, a lot of them, I lost them. And that's what their evaluation is. I understood the concept, but the moment you threw the math in that concept, I already got lost. That's what they said, because I asked them as an exit ticket, what did they learn that day? And yeah, what do they still have as difficulty understanding? And that's what they said. And that is both for my pre-IB and my regular kids. The moment the math came in, which is just a basic algebra, I already lost my kids. So the question is, how will I help them? So that's the part that I'm developing in me, the skills in how will I be able to make them comfortable with math so that they can understand better the concept. Because in my case, when I attended that STEP program at UH, I understand more the equation when I understood the concept, because they were explaining during the brief after we do the hands-on is explaining the concept, tie it to the equation that we are seeing. And that's the part that I develop really well. And then, that's why. And to my students, I'm developing that. Some of them now can actually explain, like in my IB kids, the third year physics students that I have, they can now explain comfortably concept because they have understood the relationship of the variables. And now they can defend their own answer. And now they said that they're prepared for college.
Thanks. We'll do one last question. Caitlin Knapp asks, with the diverse context from which students enter your classroom, how do you create an equitable learning environment in your class?
Thank you for that question, Caitlin. I modify my lesson. I provided accommodation to them, and I know the diversity you're talking about there, especially in regular kids. That's a lot of diversity in there, because you will have ESL and you also have some good students there who are supposed to be in a more advanced class but prefer to be in that class. So what I would do is I would ask those higher or more advanced kids in that regular class to assist their classmates, especially if they're having hard times grasping information. Or at times I will ask my student, okay, explain your work to your classmates. So because sometimes students are better than us when explaining to our students, because they can talk to their peers to their level. So I would utilize those kids that are getting the lesson really, really quick to explain it to the whole class, so that there will be, so that we can reach out to those who are still struggling. And at times also, I have to modify the assignment. Like I would only require at least do this, especially if you have a SPED student. How will you do that? Okay, or at least do the minimum in my class. But for that student to be able to do that, okay, it's already really something for me already.
Thank you. There appears to be one more question that has spurred some discussion. I don't know if you have time to address that, Dr. Chung?
Let's do, because the next session will start in 5 minutes. Please continue all the questions on Slack, as it allows asynchronous interactions, and we will do one breakout session Zoom for a participant to interact. And Caitlin can stand by. Margie, would you like to set us to the breakout rooms, please? Oh, by the way, thank all of the speakers for this session. Thank you so much.